Please
Yeah.
it's about who you are and your latest project.
Yeah, well, I'm Carlos, and I'm launching a book called Earth Wisdom Teachings, which is practical guidance from the 8 directions of the medicine wheel. I've been studying Earth Wisdom for nearly 40 years, following that path, now sharing it with interested people and creating journeys and ceremonies to take people into deep levels of consciousness, to grow, to learn, and to come into alignment with self, life, and our planet. So that's my main thing that I'm doing in life at the moment.
So maybe describe one of these sessions. So you lead people through these sessions?
Yes, well, the sessions might last for a day or up to 6 days at the moment. And so we create a kind of energetic container for people to drop deeply into. So there are certain kind of ritual actions that we'll do at the beginning to kind of step into a deeper space in ourselves. And then we'll probably introduce some teaching or an activity for people to dive into and have an experience. And so ultimately what people learn is between them and the great mystery, but we're also guiding and opening certain aspects of human consciousness from the map that we're working from.
What aspects of consciousness are you trying to open?
Well, I'm using the medicine wheel as the map, and it shows us 8 intelligences or 8 realms of consciousness that we all have. They're universal realms of consciousness. In other words, they're in the universe, but they're also in human beings. So this map speaks about these 8. I've spoken about them in the book, Earth Wisdom Teachings. There are like 8 sections to explore each one. And I don't know if you want me to go into them one by one or...
Why don't we start off with talking about what the medicine wheel is for those who don't have knowledge of it or experience with it, because it comes up.
Oh.
Maybe talk about where that is and what that is and where it comes from also.
Yeah, well, I mean, essentially it comes from North America, what we call North America, but there have been stone circles all over the world. Of course, we all know about Stonehenge, but on every continent except Antarctica, people have built circles of stone for different purposes, probably different lineages of teaching. And the medicine wheel, so the medicine wheel is like a design, a circular design that can teach us about wholeness, because it shows us the relationship between different things. So a basic foundational medicine wheel would say, well, in one direction is the sun, actually in the east, where the sun rises. Opposite that in the west, the earth. And in the south of the wheel is the sacred plants. In the north, the animals. And we humans are in the middle of that. So we're surrounded by these different aspects of creation. And each of those also corresponds to other teachings of the medicine wheel. Other medicine wheel teachings can correspond to that. So it shows us also about aspects of ourself, our spirit, our body, emotion, and our heart mind. So it's a profound body of teaching that shows deeper and deeper layers about our consciousness and the journey that we can go to awaken.
So is this from a specific Native American tribe?
It's not from a specific tribe, no. It flourished in Mexico, in the Yucatan, and there were people who carried that wisdom to the north, to various tribes, to people who were interested, but it was never part of one particular culture. Actually, I think they also gathered wisdom from different cultures. And then when Europeans conquered North America, a lot of the wise people were killed deliberately as an act of policy. And so those teachings were kept they went into secret. They were kept very, very secretly. And one particular teacher went to the north of Canada. And in time, she had an apprentice who learnt from her, who passed the teachings on. Then in about 1970, it was decided that they could be given out to interested people. It was safe now. So now they're more coming into the public domain for people who are interested. It's not like a religion that's wanting to get converts and convert people or proselytize, but really for interested people. And I happen to be interested, so that's why I'm here.
So, uh, assume I know nothing, and I actually don't. I don't know anything about the medicine wheel. So, but about shamanic things, and as a standard Western person, what states of consciousness is this a map to? Is it a deepening of self-understanding, or where does this take? Where would this take me?
Well, one thing I'd say at the beginning is that coming into self-understanding, it also corresponds with our relationship with the earth and all her expressions, not just human expressions. So it's also about our relationship with the earth and the universe, really. So coming into a deeper relationship with our self, coming to know ourself, is also parallel with coming to know the universe. And so the states of consciousness, well, I don't know what adjectives necessarily to use, but often in regular, everyday, daily consciousness, we may be thinking a lot with our brain. And so how do we quieten the thinking of the brain mind? Once we come into more stillness and into the silence of the mind, that kind of opens a door into a deeper relationship with the universe, because we're no longer kind of filtering it with our thinking. So that would be one way of starting to open these deeper levels of consciousness. And that's actually represented in one direction of the medicine wheel in the southeast. Opposite that is the northwest, which is more about how our consciousness, because we're interrelated with all of life, how our consciousness actually affects the field around us. In other words, so how we think, how we speak, how we act, it has effects. And that's obvious when we think about our actions. We turn the tap on, force it on, the water comes out, or we put the kettle on, later it boils. That's obvious. That's an action. But also our thinking and the thoughts that we're holding, they also affect our whole system. And subtly, they affect the field of consciousness around us. So that's two kind of realms of consciousness that these 8 directions are talking about.
That's very interesting because, my background is in Western magic and also a lot of the Eastern traditions. I don't know too much about indigenous, but to me, that sounds like the first one it sounds like meditation and going deep into the self. And the second one sounds like, I guess we could call magic, which is understanding, one is quieting your thoughts and the other one is controlling your thoughts to affect reality around you. So those both make sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
Through my traditions. That seems pretty straightforward. Does that sound about right to you? My mirroring back of that.
I think so. I think meditation is certainly a way of coming into the present moment, and it's a tool. So any kind of meditation that brings us into more stillness, into a silence of the mind, That yeah, I would call that meditation. Or we could say there might be states of consciousness that we could call contemplation, which is not exactly the same as meditation, but it's certainly the level of brain activity is a lot less than the ordinary, running around town shopping. So
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because that's a technical distinction that you don't hear people talk about much, mostly because I think contemplation is more of a Christian meditation concept, or that word is often used for it. But that's a very good distinction to make.
mm.
Could you describe the difference between those two states of consciousness, meditation and contemplation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, meditation is really coming into silence of the mind. I mean, of course, there are many different forms of meditation. And actually, people are using that term very broadly in different ways at the moment. Ultimately, coming fully into the present moment and into silence is meditation. I think one of the things, and having been involved in meditation for a long time, I was, meditating with the Buddhists, Theravada Vipassana meditation for a long time. I still do that, actually. That's part of my regular practice. But at the beginning, I was thinking, if I meditate, I will get somewhere. I'll get better at meditating. Or maybe I'll get enlightened. Maybe if I do this long enough, I don't know how long it takes. Maybe if I sit in meditation for a week, I'll be enlightened. And I realized there's a little trap in that. Yes, we might improve. Our concentration might improve. But there's a trap in that we're not really fully present because we're looking at the goal of being somewhere else. And I would say that contemplation is more like going into a deep state. It's not absolute silence, but you might be holding a question and seeing what emerges from the depths of your psyche in response to that question, maybe more questions. And typically in this way of earth wisdom, we might do that while sitting out in nature. So there's a sense that in a way, nature is also communicating with us if we're able to hear it. Usually we can't hear it very well because we're thinking a lot.
So I love that you brought up Vipassana because I was actually going to mention that I'm not a consistent Vipassana meditator, but I went on a 10-day retreat and it was a profound experience. And one that for a lot of reasons, as you can imagine, it was out in the desert in Palm Springs, or not, excuse me, in Joshua Tree in Southern California.
Mm.
One thing that I realized at the end is that what you're saying, which is it's not just like turn about the mind. It's not just turning off the mind. It's when we get out of the mind and back into the body, then we realize how separate we've been from nature also.
Yeah.
In every sense of the word, our own nature, but also the nature around us. And it's interesting because one of the themes that's been kind of coming out in this podcast over the last year or so is the idea that I think in the Western traditions, and I talked to a guy named John Michael Greer about this, in the Western traditions, the biggest thing that's missing is a sense of place and connection to local place and not just nature, but the specific nature around you. And that place is actually quite important. And I think that, Western people are, of course, a bit out of touch with the cycles of nature, to say the least. But it's
Mm-hmm.
so because I think that seems to be something that you don't hear people talking about a whole lot. I think that people pay lip service to the idea of getting back into nature, but understanding that for me, deep states of meditation will basically show, like, let me put it this way. When I meditated for 10 days, it took me 10 days for my brain to calm down enough just to remember that I'm actually part of the physical world.
Yeah.
Put it that way to make it as simple as possible. And that was an interesting experience.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had that experience on long meditation retreats. It does take time to really, really drop. And, perhaps on day 2 or 3, there's a kind of tiredness, a dullness that can come up, and then you start to go through that. Can be a pattern. So even though I said, I stand by what I said about trying not to think about where you're going to get through meditation, it does progress. And I think Daniel Goleman has done research on the effect of meditating for like 6 hours a day. It does begin to change the structures of the brain. So,
Yeah. Let me ask you a left field question, just because I've noticed this in a couple different places in context.
okay.
So it sounds like in your tradition, you do a lot of meditating, maybe outside in nature or in specific places you go to consistently.
Yes. But I mean, I would say that my practice isn't strictly about meditation. It's also about coming into the present moment on a regular basis. So if I'm now, this is it's all about discipline, really. So, for example, when I step into my car and sit in the car, then if I'm really practicing, then I might take a few moments before I actually start it. And then when I drive off, I'm not just listening to the radio or thinking my thoughts, unless I choose to, but I might be really paying attention to the driving. So it's a kind of like a driving meditation. I'm aware of the steering wheel, the road, the whole field of vision. So it's kind of like I'm practicing to be present wherever I am.
Mm.
So there are practices of going, and it's very helpful to go out into nature because there's a certain beingness or a presence in nature that can draw us into our beingness and presence, especially when it's like pristine, unspoilt nature. Like there isn't so much of that where I live in England. I mean, I'm on the edge of a fairly relatively wild area, but even that is farmed. There are people around. It has been touched by humans. But when you go into somewhere that's real wilderness, that can have a real effect of drawing you into the primordial self, if you like, or the primordial consciousness that we were born with, because that is primordial nature. It's very precious.
What I was going to ask you is, have you ever noticed the phenomenon of, particularly if you're meditating outside, but particularly if it's a location that a lot of people are going to over an extended period of time and meditating, like for instance, a retreat center. Have you noticed the phenomenon of the natural world changing slightly around it? Like, for instance, flowers becoming more vivid or even
Um,
animal.
oh, you froze there for a moment. I missed what you said.
So I was saying, have you ever noticed the phenomenon of local nature changing around those areas? Like, for instance, flowers becoming more vivid, or even like small wildlife becoming more colorful, or the weather changing to match meditation patterns?
Well, that's very interesting. I can't say that I have. Um, when you say things becoming more colorful, I think our sense of color can be enhanced by coming into presence.
That might be it. But I've seen this a couple places, and it seems to be the physical structure of things. Uh, anyways, bit of a tangent.
Very interesting. I'll look into that.
So you mentioned two of the directions. What are the other directions on the medicine wheel?
Right. Well, they all have multiple layers. So I think I'll start with the other non-cardinal directions. The southwest, actually, we could say the southeast coming into presence. We could say that's like sometimes we call it the first attention. And it's about training our attention to be present. So once we're able to be more present, then in the southwest, we can notice what thoughts are trying to come up. We're more aware of our thoughts because we've actually practiced meditation, come into the present moment. We can notice what thoughts are trying to come up. And we can be more aware of our purpose. So the Southwest is all about our purpose. And it could be, I mean, everything has a purpose in a sense, is to grow into its fullness. Like, you know, an acorn wants to grow into an oak tree. And each of us as human beings, we want to grow into our fullness. From being children, we grow into our fullness. And each one of us is unique. So it's maybe slightly different for each person, what our individual gift is and what we're bringing to life. So the Southwest is about coming into that deeper sense of what our spirit is yearning for, what we really want to bring to life. And when we start to hear that deep voice inside of us, it's like an underground river. If we take time to go into nature, meditate, be alone for a long time, we start to hear the spirit voice, what it is that we want to do with our life at this time. Then the thoughts that we're having, you know, are they in alignment with that, or are they distracting us? Are they taking us in a different direction? So the Southwest, as I say, multiple layers, but it's also about identifying our gift to life and following that path. And then opposite that, in the Northeast, it's about energy, recognizing our own energy, recognizing that we live in a vast ocean of energy consciousness, and we are constantly affecting the energy around us and being affected by it. But the more conscious we are of it, the more we can shift and shape it. So there's ways of becoming more aware of the energies around us, well, the energies in us, but also the energies around us, and how to begin to work with those so that they can then evolve to a greater level of consciousness, really.
That's interesting.
So
That
right now in the world, we're affected by all this news about, you know, war, climate change, blah, blah, blah. We're all being affected by that. But how are we able to stand in the center of all this and begin to shape it so it takes us all to a new level of consciousness? That's really what this work is about, is evolution of consciousness.
your answer to that, like, how do we stand, and particularly now, you know, we're recording this October 2nd. It appears to be World War III is starting yet again. It's started like 17 times in the last 2 years, 3, 4 years. What is your answer to that in terms of standing in the middle of all of that and beginning to work with it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's very easy for us to get polarized. I mean, there are polarities in life naturally, but it's very easy for us to identify with one side or the other. And I'm not saying it isn't right to stand for what we believe in, but when we are putting the other into the shadow, then we're dividing. Okay, I need to just back up and express this as clearly as possible. I think there's a way that we can take the polarities and in ourselves at least begin to bring them together. So they're not so. So, for example, I wasn't going to go into politics, but I will. There's this situation that blew up in Gaza, and whether you say one side was right and the other was wrong, I don't know. But on one level, there were fanatics on both sides. There are fanatics on both sides, from my perspective. So where is the fanatic in me? And how do I embrace both? You know, both Israel, there was a lot of grief, a lot of loss of life, you know, families torn apart, the same on the other side. Can I open my heart and feel both sides? You know, as I speak about this, I can feel the grief for both sides of the suffering that we're creating for ourselves. So can I hold both together? That holding that awareness might, on a subtle level, begin to shift the whole field. Now, we might not be able to tell that it's having an effect, but I believe it does affect the field.
I think that's very, regardless of, that's a pretty loaded political situation. I mean, it's one that's on everyone's mind. But I think it was really interesting how you say it's an internal thing, where even outside of this situation, because I have my own thoughts on it, just like everyone else. But I think that um, the idea that the work is in of how did you put it, of kind of trying to hold both positions internally and do work on that internally. I we like to think. I think that's very beautiful. And I think that sometimes that's all we can do. And we like to hope, I think, at least as spiritual people, that that has an effect. But certainly it's better than, trying to cause more violence, I suppose. But um, I think that the interesting part, the most interesting part there of what you just said is trying to find the fanatic within yourself and where you're in resonance or not with things. Um, it's certainly a call to self-awareness. I think there's not a whole lot of self-awareness these days. I don't know. That sounded like salad, but yeah, on my
Yeah,
end.
well, I mean, I'm not saying I'm always there. I'm on a journey too. I have an ego. I get reactive. I get furious with people I hear about. But then if I go deeper into it and see, well, how am I like that?
I
Uh, there is a there is a bigger perspective to hold the wholeness.
sometimes that's all we can do. I think and maybe it has an effect, maybe it doesn't, but sometimes that's kind of all we can do.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Um, One of the things that I thought was really interesting about the what you were describing in terms of the directionality, which is interesting that you see that a lot in shamanic cultures of things being attributed to the directions, is it's not necessarily hierarchical. Maybe it is in a different fashion, but you mentioned, for instance, finding one's true self in one corner, energy in the other. In the Western systems, those things are stacked and hierarchical. One is higher than the other and so forth. But this sounds like more of something perhaps that you need to attend to all of those things and balance them within yourself, which might be a better perspective on things, more practical.
Yeah, well, I think they're all interconnected. It's just looking at them on a wheel, you can see that they're in relationship. So I need to take care of my body just as much as I need to take care of my spirit. There is one place where there is hierarchy, and we could say that in the center of the circle, there is this sense of, the essence self, the essence of me. So there is that sense also. And then around the periphery, there are these, what we were just talking about with, ego, separation, these states that take us into separation from each other, from life. So how can I command those states? How can I command my own consciousness to enter into a bigger state, knowing that that will have a better effect on the field and on the whole world?
So talk about that then. How do you do that?
Um, well, I was talking about the Northwest and how our thoughts, words, and actions, they ripple out and they have an effect on the world around us. So we have to look at what are we sending into the world. Um, and we need the awareness. We need to have the presence of mind to be able to be aware of what we're sending. What thoughts am I holding? And it could be any situation. I mean, I could walk into a restaurant and think, this restaurant's terrible. The food's bad. The service is bad. They don't really care. Or I could walk into the same restaurant and think, I'm really open. I can take my time. I'm not in a hurry. They're good people and I'm going to enjoy my food. Now, I'll have two different experiences myself.
Absolutely.
But now I can't do a scientific experiment on this, but in my imagination, I believe the second attitude, I'll get better service, actually.
So I think it in the service industry would agree. I mean, if no one likes serving somebody with a bad attitude.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, that's a very straightforward example. I think, for me, the most immediate feedback, like for me, I think that's, spirituality aside, that's that skill that you're talking about, or that faculty of being able to decide what type of experience, being able to understanding that perception is a choice and decide going to react to situations is really just kind of a core skill, or maybe the core skill of human life. Because at the end of the day, we can't actually control anything except for that. Um,
Yes.
that can be pretty tricky. For me, the biggest thing in let me put it, the fastest feedback loop for that is relationships, where
Yeah.
nonstop, where you have to decide how you're going to interpret comments, or uh, what energy you're going to bring to a relationship, because it can be an immediate feedback loop. So I think that life is always trying to teach us that message, and it's easy to forget that message sometimes, particularly in stressful moments, like stressful global situations.
Yeah. Well, stress lowers our awareness, doesn't it? I mean, the more anxiety there is, the less awareness, generally speaking. But yeah, I was looking at the book again today, and one of the stories I tell in the book is of an argument I was having with my wife. Now, I can't even remember what that was about, but we were doing our usual thing, and it was getting more and more intense. Well, you do it. Yeah, but you do that.
Uh,
And I was kind of backing up. I can remember she was on the other side of the table. And for some reason, I suddenly thought, you know what? I love this woman.
yeah,
And my energy changed just having that thought. And somehow it changed the energy between us. Changing my energy, it changes the energy between us. And suddenly the whole thing was just calming down, de-escalating. I can't remember how it turned out, but we came into agreement about it, and it was okay. I didn't continue all the way down the path of being polarized in that.
great.
So, it just shows. And actually, commanding our state of consciousness, learning to do that, training ourselves to do that, it's a lifelong training. But the work that I do is all about that. Ultimately, that is the goal. Because, as you say, that's the one thing we can command, we can affect that. And in a mysterious way, that affects what happens in our world around us.
Yeah, and we also can't escape that feedback loop.
No.
It's like you can stop doing. I think everyone has a different way of looking at this. I mean, people do this with cognitive behavioral therapy as well. Um,
Yeah.
Spirituality is a little bit more fun, personally, but I think we can't escape that mechanism of life and interactions with other people. And it occurred to me as you were saying, and also because you mentioned politics, a lot of people have said that humanity wasn't ready for social media, that
Mm.
it's caused all this chaos. But it's like, as you were saying that, it's so hard to stay positive on social media rather than getting sucked in, for me at least. Um, and it, I like jumping into the mosh pit, but I think that skill that is practiced in a relation, it's like, I'm just thinking how hard that is to get just with one person, where what you bring to the situation, well, rather that you and the other person are mirroring each other and you're in a feedback loop. And it's that same skill that humanity is going to have to develop on an industrial level so that we can do that when we're connected to the entire world. That's
Yeah.
what, but I don't, I think that it's probably that simple.
Hmm. Well, I think that's absolutely right. But if we can't make peace with the person we love most, you know, how can we not keep going to war as nations?
Yeah.
I mean, the first place to make peace is in here. And sure, I mean, it's difficult. It's a long path. Probably my wife's been my biggest life teacher. I've probably learned more from that than from all the courses and trainings and ceremonies and retreats,
That's great. Yeah.
But it does, I mean, it does take, I think, an intimate relationship. You need to give time to dropping into uh, real communication. I mean, communication of what's really happening deep down. Because it's so easy to get caught if we're just living together or doing something together without giving ourselves spaces to really hear each other. Oh, that's what triggered you. Now I understand. Thank you for explaining that. And thank you for giving me the feedback. I will really look into that. Thank you. Rather than in the spur of the moment when we're hurrying to get stuff done or we're, as you say, a bit stressed about something, then it's easy to spark each other off. And without time to really go into a deeper understanding, it can just escalate and
Yeah.
gather. Yeah.
What would you say your best techniques, whether they're from the medicine wheel or not, for doing that have been? Kind of not just dropping in like that, but making sure, checking in your own, not necessarily with the other person, but in your own process of checking in with yourself, making sure that you are actually touching authenticity instead of just reacting. Because sometimes that can be tricky to tell, particularly if there's unconscious things going on.
Mm. Well, I think I'll try answering your question in terms of relationship conflict.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess one way would be to, rather than continue arguing, I might go outside and really take time, maybe go out into nature and take time in that. Now, if I've got an emotional charge, I might need to discharge that. So, maybe I'll go in the woods and shout or, ask the earth to hold some of that emotion. And it's not damaging to the earth or to the trees, but just to clear that and then coming into this sense of present moment awareness. So if I can create a little, you know, I'm sure you've experienced this with meditation, that as you come into presence, it brings you more space, inner spaciousness. And with that spaciousness, that leads to a higher awareness.
Mm-hmm.
So then you can see, oh, well, that's what it was. When she said that, that's how I felt really triggered.
Yeah.
And I got triggered because it reminds me of blah, 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 all that.
Yeah.
Then I can understand it. So then I can go back in and we can talk about it. But often creating a space to just talk about it, to sit down, maybe we light a candle, phone off the hook, no distractions, but really sit there and listen. And actually really listen. Face, have I really heard your side of it? This is what I heard. Is that correct? And then the other person say, yeah, that's correct, but you missed this bit. I mentioned this. Then I think when a person feels heard emotionally, that can go a long way to diffusing it. It's not that you're saying they're right. It's not that you're saying, I agree, I'm going to do exactly what you say. It's saying, I really understand how you felt.
Yeah. I find
And that,
that's key, particularly in communicating with women, I think. And I'd have to do a little bit of extra work to do that, I think. Yeah,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's you mentioned spaciousness. I find that getting into that, I have a couple thoughts about that. If you're able to get into spaciousness, I think there's a physiological component of that where you're getting out of sympathetic into parasympathetic awareness,
Mm.
getting out of
Yeah.
fight or flight. And when you have spaciousness, the spaciousness is not even necessarily to suddenly realize you're wrong, because I think for me, like if I get into fights, there's always a temptation to say, part of me just wants to win, but there's also a part of me that says, hey, if I just completely flip my view, maybe the conflict will go away. Maybe I was wrong. And that's not necessarily always the right approach either. But I think that in holding spaciousness, it's not necessarily to say, oh, I was wrong all along. It's more like just being able to hold more than just your view, being able to hold more viewpoints and allow,
Yeah.
and I think that's important. You mentioned some things about repeating the stuff back to the other person and patterns. Are you aware of imago therapy?
No, I'm not.
It's another relationship. It's basically the same thing. I mean, I'm sure this stuff is in a lot of different methods.
Yeah.
That's neither here nor there. But I think that you mentioned when you realize you're triggered, thinking back, oh, this reminds me of XYZ. The reason I bring up that therapy is I think a lot of particularly psychotherapeutic methods come at that with the assumption that whatever it is that the trigger reminds you of has to be something from your childhood or your family environment as a child. And I don't necessarily think that's always true. I think a lot more immediate than that. And I think that constantly looking for triggers in your childhood can tend to re infantilize somebody. Maybe that's just an aside, but that's kind of it.
Yeah, I agree.
Just kind of speaking out loud some of my passage through similar territory here.
Mm. Mm. I agree. I think going back to what we were talking about, this be it coming into presence, and that is a key thing, because it's also like when you're listening to somebody, especially if there's an emotional charge to what they're saying, if you can really listen without thinking about what you're going to say back, it really goes a long way to heal them. If you're kind of listening but you're looking at your phone and you know doing other stuff, it's not really going to bring that kind of healing.
Right. So you think that just holding space and listening is kind of
Uh,
the
I'm not saying that's the only thing. We do need to represent ourselves as well and speak up and bring our side in. I think what you were saying about somehow going beyond this sense in us that says one of us is right, I'm either right or wrong. Now, to part of me, it's very important that I'm right. And of course I am right, but no, that's a joke. But um, part of us really wants to be right. And, in arguments, we can feel like the other person is wanting to make us wrong. Now, if we can somehow go beyond this idea that one person is right and the other is wrong, I think that is what I was talking about with the higher consciousness, or the resolution consciousness that's holding both sides. If we can get that big, and I think we all can, we all have that potential to do that, then that's going to go a long way. But I come back to the sense that, the consciousness is what all this in the world comes from. The invisible world, the unseen world, is primary in creating what goes on in our world. So the world that we're experiencing in the news at the moment is the result of how our consciousness has been and is at the moment. And I'm holding the idea that we have the potential to evolve to a new level of consciousness. So that's why I'm really bringing this book out and, hoping that it will touch many hearts and minds and help us along in this evolutionary process.
I hope so. And I think that, in general, this is something that I do think that how do you put it? The more immanent and nature-based traditions need to speak up for themselves more, I think, because we're back in the Middle Ages again, it seems. And
Yeah.
there's been so much explosion of consciousness and access to techniques and traditions since the 1950s, really, but 1960s, that could go away, that suddenly we have access to and could go away so easily. And, that's one of the reasons why I do this podcast is I think that these ways of seeing the world and these techniques need to be more widely available. And what you believe in, your belief system really does change everything. And you talked about, how your thoughts change reality around you. Well, what religion you follow, definitely religions have massive effects on the world. And I think one of the biggest flaws in a lot of modern political thinking is to completely discount religion, not necessarily discounting it as a life option, but simply ignoring the fact that people behave and make decisions based on their beliefs and not necessarily just economic factors or material factors. And we do live in a world, particularly, and I think the internet is making this more and more clear. We do live in a world that's an endless psychic field that is being contested. That there is factionality within. So,
Mm.
and that filters down all the way to the real world.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's absolutely right. I think what you've said is very interesting there, because I think that what we need to do as adults is to actually look again at our beliefs that we've taken in as children and choose, well, do we really want to believe that now? Because we're all in self-authority. We're authors of our lives. And we don't have to just believe what we're told. When we were children, yes, we took it in. We didn't have any choice, really. We just unconsciously, took in from our parents, from our school, from religion, from our peer group, these different structures of consciousness. But I think as adults, we do need to take time to review those structures and decide, well, what is it that we really want to hold now about these different things? And that will enable us to continue to learn and grow.
What has that process been like for you through your life of unlearning and choosing new things to adopt?
Right.
It's a big question, but
Yeah, I don't know. How long have you got?
podcast.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, I was brought up in a regular family in England. I mean, my education was just an ordinary middle-class education. I mean, when I was a kid, we weren't that well off, but my father got better paid as I grew up. And, we seemed to be okay with that. I was given an education, but something was missing. So I felt, actually, on some level, I felt a bit alienated by the system of just getting a job. Industrial consumerism just wasn't enough for me. I needed more meaning. And so I think over time, those structures, those beliefs, like when I was about 16, I thought, okay, I'm going to be an atheist. I'm going to be a hedonist. I'm just going to go for pleasure. I mean, it's very sort of teenage sort of idea, isn't it? The only thing that matters in life is my pleasure. And then I went hitchhiking. Ended up in Egypt, visiting the temples there,
Okay.
and was so impressed. I mean, why would people take so much trouble over all this for a religion? So gradually, I began to open my mind, and the things that I was exposed to started opening my mind. And then I had some really big opening experiences that showed me that there was more to life than we thought. And
Those that you're comfortable talking about. That sounds like a good
well, yeah, I mean, basically, I had an experience of oneness. Years later, listening to Buddhist Dharma, I thought, oh, that was nirvana. That was a nirvanic experience, just touching into that, where I felt that there was a certain sameness about me connected with other people. And there was something much bigger behind everything. There was a sense of oneness, and that I didn't really need to pursue anything to come into my wholeness. Maybe I just needed to relax a bit more and allow it to be there. I quickly went back into a more ego-based consciousness, but I knew that was true, what I'd experienced there. So that kind of got me onto this path of questing into different traditions. And at one point, somebody said, "Well, look, you'd love this. You'd love nature. Why don't you come to this?" So that's when I first touched into the medicine wheels and those teachings. And that was about getting on for nearly 40 years ago.
Oh.
So I'm still learning. There's still more to learn. And yeah, I love it.
You've been consistent with medicine wheel stuff for 40 years.
Yeah, nearly that. Yeah.
Cool. Did you come drop in and out of it at times? Like, was your faith tested, or have you been pretty much straight shot?
Um, not really. I went through a training of process-oriented psychology, which I think is really, really good. And I joined a training for that. And then some people came along with some more medicine wheels. And I thought, well, I can't do that. I'm doing the process work training. And then they said, well, we're going to do a training journey. So I gradually thought, oh, maybe I can do both. So halfway along this training journey in going deeper into medicine, earth medicine, I thought, well, actually, I don't need the process work. So I dropped that and I continued with that path. So I have been pretty dedicated to it. And part of that dedication is the feeling that it's helping me challenging time. We've brought these huge challenges to ourselves, and I'm still holding that the medicine wheel has the power to benefit our destiny, not in a way of trying to convert anybody, but just offering it really. And you actually don't really need to have it as a faith. You can be Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, and still learn something from it. It's not an exclusive thing.
Talk about in leading these sessions of leading people now, having so much experience, but then leading people through these medicine wheel sessions. I'm curious, without naming names or identifying information, of course, some of the breakthroughs you've seen people have, and maybe some of the biggest challenges you've faced in facilitating those. Because sometimes people can really grind on things. They can have a challenging time.
Yeah. Well, yes. I mean, there are some teachings that people can get a bit caught up in, and it's really looking at their shadow side. And we tend to put the emphasis on the bright side, not ignoring, the parts of us that are a bit distorted in different ways when we get into judgment mind or, feeling separate from others or putting other people down. It's easy for us to go there. We're kind of trained into that. And it can be that people get a bit stuck in that. So when I'm teaching people, I say, don't get obsessed with that. Put more energy into seeing your infinite nature, that you're an expression of the universe. You're an expression of consciousness. I mean, that's kind of a fundamental reshaping of who we think we are. We're told, here's your passport, your name, date of birth, country of origin. That's a surface level of identity, but at a deeper level, who are we really? So I think that, I mean, for my own breakthroughs, I think realizing that it's okay to like yourself or love yourself, even just saying that, you know, from my conditioning, I can hear inside myself, even as I say that on air, you know, when I say it's okay to love yourself, it sounds part of it's going,
No,
because
no,
that's a
that,
upbringing.
that's really hard, right? That can be really hard for people. I don't know if that, you know, I'm sure it would be fascinating to look at that cross culturally, and you know, different cultures may feel differently about that. But yeah, I was just, you know, I was just thinking about that. That's such a simple thing, yet it's so hard to do. And I was just in New Orleans, and I was kind of having that experience and thinking about it. And sometimes it really is that simple. If people can just, let's at least have positive self-regard
Yeah.
and be compassionate to themselves. Because you always see also with spirituality, people will be compassionate to everyone except themselves. This is quite common, I find. And and why do you think that that's so hard for people? And I'm not saying somebody who's cracked that. I mean, I think I've had, you know, I'm feeling, you know, as I'm, you know, getting older or something. Luckily, I feel that this comes to me more frequently. But yeah, why do you think that that's so hard for people?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think from my own experience, I mean, I have been with, you know, being quite down on myself most of my life, probably.
Okay.
And, you know, realizing actually it's okay. I am enough. You know, we have this deep belief that we're not enough. And I was talking to somebody about it the other day, and what came to me was the sense that actually when we're down on ourselves, we're actually reinforcing our sense of separateness, or our, if you like, we're actually reinforcing our ego. We are getting something out of that, or part of us is. And I think it's the ego part. And I don't want to get down on the ego, but we need to understand that there are other parts of us. We're much more than that. We are a much bigger being than we think we are. So I think there is a payoff for being hard on ourselves. It's not just that we think by being hard on ourselves we'll get the result we want, or that we learnt it from our parents. I mean, I know as a parent, you know, you think, oh, I can give them a reward if they do the right thing, or I can, you know, punish them to get them to do the right thing. So there is this, you know, partly from our parenting techniques, but also the way we're parenting ourselves, that sometimes we think if we're harsh to ourselves, we'll get ourselves to do the right thing. But I think there might be more to it than that.
Well, yeah, I was gonna say, you know, I'm always, I feel like when I really get down on myself, I'm trying to force myself to work harder usually. But
Yeah.
there's more to, what do you think the more, like, what do you think the deeper level is there? You said you think there might be more to it than that.
Yeah, well, I think there is this sense of somehow feeding our ego, that somehow we're special because we're the worst person.
I know the feeling. Yeah.
I'm worse than everybody else. I'm really the most unlovable person in the world.
Right. The negative.
Yeah, so what, you know, so how come, you know, you love lakes, you love the seaside, you love mountains, you love flowers. How come you're not lovable if you're part of all this? So, yeah, I think it's important to love ourselves, even if we make mistakes,
Right.
even if we lack awareness at times, you know, we all lack awareness at times. And it's just a growth. If we're able to open, and if somebody challenges us, I mean, I've not always been open to challenge. Sometimes don't like it. In fact, yeah, I mean, okay, the other day I sort of resisted my wife's challenge. It was just a silly thing. We were walking down the road it was a little village, and I was walking with the dog, and she said, "You better, there's a car coming. Get out the road." And I did, and it pulled in front of us, and it was a taxi. And I said, "I knew it was there. I knew it was a taxi, and that it was going to stop here." And we both laughed because we knew I was lying, but in some way I was being defensive about that because I didn't want to be told what to do. Anyway, I'm digressing a bit, but I think the more we believe in ourselves and the more we love ourselves, the more we can then open to being challenged. And then if we can open to being challenged, then we can learn something.
We can also stick up for ourselves when it's called for, when we love ourselves.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
I'm not talking about just being walked over.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tricky to find that line. But this is great. I think my perception is I think that the global spiritual culture, and I do think we should start referring to the global spiritual culture as a culture, regardless of tradition. I think that because we're all fellow travelers in one way or the other, I think that the global spiritual culture has matured a lot on the question of the ego over the last several decades. I think, in the, particularly you hear stories about the 60s where the attitude towards the ego is it has to be annihilated. You get this from you get this from the early psychedelic days. And I think that people who are lifelong, spiritual people, there's been a lot more awareness, even in, I think in the last 20 years of observing it, where people have said they've come to a less antagonistic attitude towards the ego, and not just the ego, but all aspects of self. You get that where people talk about, sometimes setting a boundary is not a bad thing. Sometimes, or certainly that you shouldn't be in an antagonistic adversarial relationship to yourself. And I think that's a healthy development.
Yeah, I totally agree with that.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I like to, this is obviously just a concept, but I like to think that there is part of us that we could call ego, which is that part that tends to take us into separation. And then there's also the little I, the little self. And obviously all these are related, but there's also the big I, the infinite self, which, we're in a relation. You could say there's a kind of relationship with that from the little I to the universal I, if you like, the deep self. And if we're in relationship with that, then we can open to that and see and actually learn something from it. But I think we need to, as you say, we not being down on the ego or the little I.
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of like an appendix. People used to think you could just cut it out and get rid of it. It's like, well, it turns out that's where all these important, microbiome comes from, and it's actually essential for your overall mental health, even.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would like to think that people are kind of, and the current moment, of course, is a big challenge because it's without getting too deep into it, because I'm sure people are sick of hearing me talk about it. It's a moment where we really are being challenged to say what are our values and what do we stand for.
Yeah.
And that's, that can be stressful, but hopefully it can also encourage some introspection and growth.
Yes, I think that's a real edge for all of us, is to stand for what we believe in and still be able to open to the other who doesn't agree, and to try and understand where they're coming from and to see some kind of value in their perspective. I think it's really difficult, and yet it's a paradox that we are opening to the other, and yet also standing for what we stand for. We need to somehow go beyond either or in that.
Have you found any interesting ways through that for yourself?
Well, that's maybe that's my growing edge, or one of the many. But yeah, I think with I'm just thinking about my brother-in-law and really trying to encourage him to, because we're kind of different about a lot of perspectives on things, you know. Yeah, I think making a space and asking questions. Oh, so you believe that? So what about this? Have you thought about that? And drawing him out. And that can at least create some kind of dialogue and some kind of bridge between us. And it's not that he's going to necessarily give up his perspective and suddenly, oh, Carlos, thank you so much. I agree with you now. You were right. Which would be great, of course, but I don't think he's going to do that. But at least there's a bridge there. And I'm also opening to see the other perspective and see at some level, even at a homeopathic dose of that, could be valuable.
That's great. Well, I will say, I don't know if I don't know, this is American politics, but we had the vice presidential debate last night. And I don't know if you watched it or not, but both, you have it's a pretty contentious presidential election. People have opinions about it, but it was actually very cordial and pleasant, and it reminded me of what debates used to be like, where each side, there were a lot of points of agreement. There were a lot of extremely serious, contentious policy things brought up, but there were a lot of points of agreement, and you got a sense that Vance and Walz were generally had respect for each other, and at one said they would support the other person if the other side lost. Of course, there were some other very disturbing things said as well, but that for me, politics aside, was encouraging because I don't know what. Well, I mean, the UK is pretty hyped up at the moment, but in the US we have the election, and people are more polarized now than they probably ever have been before, to the point where it feels like the Civil War again. And there's been a lot of violence in England as well on other issues. So just to, maybe it's like it's just back to like, can we at least be cordial with each other if we have different opinions? And I think it's a bigger deal than it seems. And so that was at least one encouraging sign for me. And now I don't know what's gonna happen in the future, but I think that I would hope that people are at the level where they're starting to realize, if we don't at least make an attempt to understand the other side, we're gonna blow each other up in a nuclear war. Like, it feels like it's all back on the table again.
Yeah.
And I think that threat of nuclear war in the 50s through the 80s is really what forced out and drove so much of the emphasis on going back to other wisdom traditions and spirituality and things like that. And so I think that that's a role that people who are in the global spiritual culture need to actively play now, because now we seem to be back in, much more serious circumstances.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'd like to think that the crisis that we're in, the ecological crisis, is something that I pay a lot of attention to as well.
Yeah.
And these polarized politics that seem to be all over the place. I mean, a lot of politics of Europe is going like that. And as you mentioned earlier, there's a social media influence on that we, getting a lot of information from social media. We're getting echo chambers agreeing with us rather than stepping across and listening to the other. So I really do agree, but I'd like to believe that the crisis is also forcing us towards more of a spiritual awakening. So I think certainly there are a lot more people who are involved in the global spiritual culture now than in the 1950s.
Yeah.
But you reminded me of a story I heard of. I do quite a lot of work in Denmark,
Okay.
and there's a story of the first Danish Muslim MP, and what she did. I mean, she got a lot of hate mail from people in Denmark. We don't want Muslims MPs. I mean, it was probably a lot worse than that, let's face it. But I don't know what the messages were exactly. But what she decided to do was she thought, I will contact these people. And she would contact them, bring them up, say, look, I got this message from you. Can I come round and discuss it? And she would go round and sit with these people. I mean, it was really challenging to do that. She would go and sit there, drink tea with them, and really listen to their fears that Denmark was being taken over or swamped with immigrants, and so she could really, really understand. And I can't help but admire that kind of courage to actually go and listen to the other.
Yeah, that's very courageous. That's a much better response than some of the stuff that happened in the Netherlands with Theo van Gogh and things like that. Yeah. Well, the other great thing about spirituality also is it's something that people can agree on across transnational borders. And I think that my experience, particularly having run this podcast for 10, I think over 10 years now, is I can talk to somebody on spiritual topics from any tradition, from anywhere in the world, and we immediately have a sense of not everything, but there's a certain shared experience, and maybe that experience is of internal states, right, which are not political. They're inhuman across all cultures and religions, and I think that that's such a beautiful thing, and it's no wonder to me that people need spirituality more than ever. People need spirituality in crisis points. That was true during the fall of the Soviet Union, and I'm sure is true in Russia now. And that is something that, particularly with the internet, that can continue to bring people together. And I think you mentioned something about, you're talking about social media and politics. And one thing that occurred to me is you were mentioning earlier, we were talking about, your thoughts affect reality, and they certainly can affect what you say and what you do and what you put out into the world. And we were talking about how that's kind of on a whole new level with social media. But it also made me think of, a couple of years ago when the Facebook whistleblower came out. She said that, I don't know if you remember this, she said that the social media companies now have so much power that what's happening is the reason why politics are going so crazy is all over the world is social media is making people more and more polarized. And then the politicians have to cater to those polarized positions to get elected. So it's all a feedback loop from what you're thinking, what you're putting out on social media to who gets elected. It's all of a cybernetic feedback loop. And, it's something that just like we need to take control of in a relationship, we need to take control of with our relationship with the whole world. And I think that social media in a lot of ways fulfills the long held Buddhist goal of making people understand that they're all interconnected, but right in your face every day, every moment of everything way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's right. I think it's had a huge impact. I don't know what it would be like for politicians to really step out of line. And well, like in this country, I know that having immigrants come in is in many ways helpful. Actually, of course, we're all immigrants in this country, because it was covered in ice until 10,000 years ago. So ultimately, I mean, the whole thing about immigration on one level is just simple some people saying, look, we were here first, so you can't come in.
Right.
I know it. I don't mean to belittle people's feelings, but on one level, that's right. And we're getting more and more of it because of climate change. And, our interconnectivity is that people all over the world, they can see things from all over the world. They can see the wealth, the material wealth
Yeah.
in the very developed countries.
Yeah.
Why shouldn't they have it?
That's something I haven't thought about a whole lot. That's interesting. Yeah, because I was just thinking about the other day how I can't imagine what it's like right now growing up and you're 7, 8 years old and where you would have maybe, you're middle class or poor, lower middle class. And whereas before you would have had a consciousness of that, but it wouldn't have, you would have been in simpatico with the people around you. Now people are looking at like Instagram influencers who are sailing around on yachts and thinking that's, if I don't have that, there's something wrong with me. I can't
Yeah.
love because I'm not sailing around, or, doing all these crazy things that influencers do, which are mostly fabricated. And I think that's really, really bad for society. But I hadn't thought about it in the context of people in the developing world now seeing how the first world lives. That's probably got to. I mean, that was true with television always, but yeah, that's got to cause quite a lot of resentment.
Mm. Well, I think one thing we haven't spoken about is community. The sense of community, people living in community. We're now much bigger sense of the global community, and we have sort of online communities of like-minded people that we relate to. Actually, I live in an area where there's a lot of open-minded people. So I know a lot of people around here, and there is a certain sense of community. But you hear about people living in villages as humans have done for thousands of years, how having a sense of community, celebrating together, celebrating the cycle of the seasons, and so on, and sharing something that I don't think I've ever truly experienced. So that is going out as people decide they want more of the material wealth.
Let's bring it back to the medicine wheel. So
Yes.
is wants to get back in touch with something more than material wealth and wants to get back in touch with the deeper levels of themselves. And they don't have any experience of this. Of course, they should buy your book, but how can they begin to investigate this? And maybe if you could share maybe just a teaching or two that maybe people could begin to apply.
Yeah, well, I think ultimately the teaching is the earth or life. The teacher is the earth or life going out on the earth. I think just one way to start would be to spend time going out into nature and being with nature and practicing meditation or whatever it is that we can do to come into the present moment awareness. One thing we didn't speak about earlier is using the senses, the sense perceptions. So the more we can come into the visual, just opening the visual space rather than thinking so much, but actually using, I've spoken about this in the book, so that's another reason to get it. But, using our sense perceptions, that helps to bring the consciousness more fully present or to awaken us to get that attention into the present moment. So if we go out into nature and do that, or just go and obviously you can't look at the sun, but go and be with the sun and just appreciating all these different aspects of life. I guess that's one way of starting. It's helpful to have a teacher, to have contact with somebody like that. And I mean, there are people out there who are trained and able to hold retreats and ceremonies for people. I am involved in a journey called Evocative Leadership Mastery, which is a very transformative program. People come in person. They come about 5 times, and we have a retreat for 6 days. And we open each of these intelligences, each of these directions around the wheel. We open each one of those through experience, but also through practical tools that people can actually practice in their lives. And the idea is that they go away and they start practicing over the next 2 or 3 months to open that direction.
Okay.
So creation intelligence, perceptual intelligence, emotional intelligence, pathfinding intelligence, sustaining intelligence, predictive intelligence, decisive intelligence, and what we call energia intelligence. That's the 8 intelligences around the wheel. So I speak about these in the book, but of course, without practice, we don't actually get the experience. So the practices are there in the book. Of course, having somebody guide you or being accountable to other people and saying, yeah, I did the practice. This is what I learned. This is what works for me. That can be very helpful.
Yeah, that's pretty intensive. So it's kind of that you go through the whole wheel of the year is what it sounds like. That's pretty intensive.
Yeah, well, I mean, people still go to work and they do their job, but the idea is that they have 6 days, 4 times 6 days over a year in training, and then they go away and they practice. So they're going out to work, they're doing stuff at home, they're doing their regular life, but they're actually doing all those things and looking at all those things through that lens and just noticing what they're learning from that. It's not like be doing it all the time, but
what kind of transformations do you see people making over the course of that year?
Yeah, well, I think it's kind of comes back to that question you asked earlier about the biggest breakthroughs. And I think people are realizing as they learn how to activate these intelligence in them deliberately. I mean, those things are in us already in potential. They're in everybody in potential. But the more consciously we're able to actually activate them, then that can make a big difference to how we are influencing what happens in life, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier. But actually doing that deliberately and consciously, so consciously choosing the effect that we want to have, or at least choosing the state of consciousness that we want to be operating from. So it can be a big, very transformative. If people really bring themselves to that and bring themselves to the practice, it's very transformative. I mean, I hope that just reading the book will inspire people. But at the end of the day, reading a book is one thing, and practicing it and, really living it is what the transformation is, not just reading about it.
I'm curious, do you see, are there real patterns in what people bring to this wanting to change? What areas of life they're wanting to work on? Is it all over the map, or are there pretty consistent themes?
I think people probably come to that training journey from having already done quite a lot of personal work, and they want to grow bigger. So they may even be working in personal development work. They may be coaches, life coaches, and they want to go deeper into it. So they may already have done some work on themselves. Typically, it might be that they want to transform some kind of self-belief that is holding them back, that feels they're not enough in some way. Typically, that might be deep down. So we do some practices to shift that, at least to bring those beliefs up to consciousness. So the more we're aware of these things that are operating in us, if we're not really aware that they're operating, they'll just carry on. But surfacing them, then we can actually, sort of ritual breaking of that old pattern and taking in a new structure, really. So that's one thing that we do. And I would say that's more in the realm of emotional intelligence, which is all about responding to life rather than reacting, having that space to respond from.
Okay.
And then each of these intelligences supports all the others. So they're not separate, but we can separate them out to look at them more closely or look through that lens.
Do you just do these in the UK, or are they all over the world?
Well, no, we're working in Spain, and there'll be another one in Turkey. I've got colleagues working in Japan as well at the moment. So, yeah.
Not in the US?
Well, there have been in the US, and a couple of my colleagues, they are from the US. So hopefully there will be more over there as well at some future time. Yeah.
I have to ask, because you mentioned megaliths also. Do you feel that there is a connection between the megalithic culture in the UK and some of these other ones in North America or around the world? A bit of left field question, but you mentioned stone circles, so I thought.
Well, I really can only speculate about that. I would love to believe there was. I don't know. I mean, the megalithic culture that came into what we now call UK, I mean, we're talking about, I think, about 8,000 years ago. Actually, they started building on Stonehenge about 8,000 years ago. And then the big megaliths came a bit later than that. So whether they were connected with the cultures directly connected with the people in the Americas, I don't know. It would be lovely to think so, but I can only speculate about that, really.
All right. Well, if people want to find out about your book and you and the retreats that are going on, and where should they look?
Well, the book is coming out actually on the 15th of October in the USA. You can pre-order it. If you go to my website, there's a page on there. The website's named after me, carlosphilipglover.com. So there's a page there where you can click through and pre-order or buy the book. That's very grateful if you do that, and hope you really enjoy it. I think it is actually a good book. I mean, we have this saying in England, I would say that, wouldn't I? But actually, a lot of people have said that to me. So, so that's one thing. And the other one that I just mentioned, the evocative leadership mastery, again, to just Google evocative leadership mastery, and you should find out more information about that, or get in touch with me directly through my website.
All right. Well,
You're very welcome. And whether you whatever you do, whether you don't, I mean, just want to wish people well with their journey, whatever they do with it. We're all growing together.
Yes. Yes. And I really, maybe we should cap it there, but thank you for those well wishes for everyone. I think that was a great conversation. And
yeah, I really appreciated that.